In the autumn of 1881, in the high desert country of southern Colorado, a man stood in a dooryard and told his wife to burn everything she owned. He did not say it once. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who has already decided, who has already arranged the new life he intends to step into, and who requires the old one to disappear cleanly behind him. He had the papers drawn. He had a new name for himself, some thought and a direction no one asked about. He needed her gone, and he needed her gone without evidence. Hattie Morse was 27 years old. She had 41 cents, a wool dress, and a pair of leather boots with the left heel worn through to the nail. She had been married to Clement Morse for 6 years, and in those 6 years, she had watched him sell off the cattle, the good plow horse, the silver candlesticks her mother had sent from Ohio, and finally the land itself, in parcels to men who did not bother to visit the site before they signed. She had watched all of it go, without a word that mattered, because a word from Hattie Morse did not matter in Cutter's Fork, Colorado. There was, however, one thing left. It sat in the corner of the back room, and it had always sat there in the corner of the back room, and no key Clement had ever tried had opened it. It was a steamer trunk, iron-banded, with a brass plate on the face that had no lock mechanism anyone could see from the outside. It was her father's. He had been a locksmith by trade and a cabinet maker by preference, and he had built the trunk himself in his shop in Chillicothe, Ohio, when Hattie was 11 years old, and she had watched him do it over the course of 3 winter Saturdays with the stove burning cherry wood and the smell of fresh-cut walnut in the air. She knew what the trunk contained because her father had shown her. She knew how to open it because her father had taught her. She had not opened it in 6 years because she had not needed to, and because she had understood, without being told, that the trunk was the last thing she had. Clement said, "Burn it all." She waited until he rode out of sight down the canyon road, and then she carried the trunk to the wagon herself. If you have ever had to let go of almost everything, you understand what that moment asks of a person. What it asks is not sentiment and not rage. What it asks is clarity. Hattie Morse had clarity in abundance. She tied the trunk with a rope to the wagon bed, climbed to the seat, and drove north toward the town of Cutter's Fork, without a backward look at the house or the dooryard or the smoke Clement had left rising from the cook fire. The trunk weighed 83 pounds. She had weighed it once on the grain scale at her father's shop years before, curious, and the number had stayed with her the way numbers do when they are attached to something that matters. In Cutter's Fork, she rented a room above the dry goods store from a widow named Frances Dugan, who asked no questions and charged $2 a week, which Hattie did not yet have. Frances accepted an IOU written on the back of a sugar receipt and told her the room faced east, which meant the morning light was good. The room was narrow, with a single window and a rope-strung bed and a wooden peg on the wall where a previous tenant had hung a hat. There was a small iron stove in the corner and a pile of last year's newspapers beside it for tinder. Hattie set the trunk against the wall opposite the window and set her satchel on the floor and sat on the bed and looked at both of them. She had 41 cents. She had the trunk. She had her father's name, which meant nothing in Cutter's Fork, and her husband's name, which she intended to use only as long as legally required. She had no reference, no sponsorship, no cousin in the territory, no letter of introduction. She had driven the wagon into town and left the wagon at the livery with the driver's letter. She had written herself, telling the owner it was Clement's property and could be claimed against whatever he owed, because she had no feed for the animal and no place to keep it, and the wagon had never been hers. She was, on that October afternoon, as alone as she had ever been. She was also, for the first time in 6 years, free to think without waiting to see whether her thinking would require defending. That was not nothing. She held it for a moment, the way you hold a tool before you identify what it is for. She spent the first afternoon sitting on the floor beside the trunk with her back against the wall, not opening it yet. She was thinking the way her father had taught her to think before touching a mechanism. He had told her when she was 12, and impatient and already starting to understand the shop's quiet grammar, that the worst thing a locksmith could do was reach for a lock before understanding what it was trying to say. She had thought that was poetry at 12. By 27, she knew it was engineering. The trunk, to an untrained eye, had no visible lock. There was the brass plate centered on the face below the lower iron band, which appeared to be purely decorative. There were 6 panels on the lid, inlaid in alternating walnut and cherry, in a grid of 2 rows and 3 columns, and they appeared to be purely decorative as well. There were 2 iron clasps, one on each end of the front face, which swung freely and locked nothing. And there was, on the underside of the right rear corner, a small brass stud that did not appear to be anything at all. Her father had called it a sequence trunk, which was not a trade term but his own name for a mechanism he had never seen anyone else build. The inlaid panels were the lock. Each panel, pressed in the correct order, actuated a pin inside the lid that aligned with a plate inside the body of the trunk. 6 panels, pressed in the order he had shown her, then the stud on the underside turned 90 degrees, and the lid lifted. She pressed the panels in order. She heard nothing and felt almost nothing. The faintest movement in the wood, the sense of resistance releasing by fractions. She reached under the back right corner and turned the stud. The lid lifted. Her father had packed it himself in 1875, 3 months before he died of a fever in Chillicothe. There was his good set of locksmithing tools, wrapped in oilcloth. 22 pieces in their own fitted slots in a tray of the same walnut as the trunk panels. There was a ledger, small and brown, his handwriting in pencil on the first 40 pages. There were 3 letters tied in cord, and on top of the letters there was an envelope with her name on it in his hand. She read the letter first. He had written it knowing he was dying, which gave it a particular quality she had to sit with before she could continue. He told her what was in the ledger. He told her about the tools, each one by name and function, and how to use the 3 she had not yet learned. He told her that the tools were good steel, Sheffield manufacture, and that any competent locksmith working the Western Territories would find steady work with them, and that he believed she was a more competent locksmith than she knew, and that she should not give the tools to anyone, and should not let anyone tell her what her hands were or were not suited for. She sat for a long time with the letter in her lap. Then she read the ledger. Her father, in the last 4 years of his life, had worked as the contract locksmith for the Colorado Meridian Land Company, which operated out of Denver and held deed to an estimated 40,000 acres of range and farmland in the Cutter's Fork Basin. He had gone there twice, in the winter of 1872 and again in the spring of 1874, to service the company's document safes and to install new mechanisms on 3 of their branch offices. He had taken notes, in pencil, in the ledger, the way he took notes on everything, because he believed in writing down what you saw while you could still see it. What he had written down was specific, and it was damning. He had seen the deeds. He had been in the room when a company officer named Harlan Foss moved deed papers from one safe to another, and the papers he had seen bore names that did not match the names on the county land rolls, which he had checked afterward at the Cutter's Fork assessor's office out of a locksmith's methodical habit. He had written down the names he saw on the deeds, and he had written down the names on the county rolls, and he had written down the discrepancies. 34 discrepancies. 34 properties where the deed in the company safe named the Colorado Meridian Land Company as owner and the county roll named a private family or individual who had, in fact, paid for the land and received a filed certificate, but whose certificate had since vanished from the county record. Hattie set the ledger on the floor and looked at the wall for some time. She picked up the 3 letters tied in cord. They were not her father's letters. They were copies, in a hand she did not recognize, of correspondence between Harlan Foss and a Denver attorney named Aldred Crane, and they described, in the clipped administrative language of men who do not consider themselves criminals, the systematic substitution of private deed certificates with company-held instruments, the destruction of the county originals by a clerk named Boone, who had since left the territory, and the redistribution of the cleared titles to land speculators in Chicago and St. Maine. Lewis, at a markup her father had calculated in pencil in the margin, at roughly 400%, she understood why her father had kept the trunk locked. She understood why he had sent it with her when she married and moved to Cutter's Fork. She understood why he had written her name on the envelope. If you have ever held a thing that a dead man carried because he trusted you to carry it, you understand the weight that does not register on a grain scale. She did not sleep much that night. She lay on the bed in the east-facing room above Francis Dugan's dry goods store and worked through what she knew and what she could demonstrate and what she needed. She was a locksmith's daughter in a territory where no woman had ever held a locksmith's certificate, and she was recently separated from a man who had not thought to ask what was inside the trunk before he told her to burn it. These were the facts. She arranged them in the order of their usefulness. In the morning, she went to the dry goods store and asked Francis Dugan if she had a recent directory for Cutter's Fork and the surrounding county. Francis had one 2 years out of date, and Hattie sat at the counter and went through it until she found a name. There was one family, the Bernal family, listed with an address on River Street, who had filed a homestead claim in 1871 on 80 acres of bottomland south of town. She had seen their name in her father's ledger. She had seen it on the discrepancy list. She walked to River Street. The house was a frame house, small and tidy, with a kitchen garden running along the south wall. A woman her own age, or slightly older, was hanging, washing on a line strung between the corner post and a cottonwood. Hattie introduced herself, and the woman, whose name was Luz Bernal, looked at her with the particular caution of someone who has learned to be careful with strangers. Hattie asked if the family still had their original homestead certificate, the certificate issued by the county assessor in 1871, with the assessor's seal. Liz Bernal set down the shirt in her hands and said very quietly that her mother had sewn it into the lining of a coat in 1875 because a man from the land company had come to the house and told her father the original certificate was invalid and that a new filing was required. And her father had not wanted to hand the certificate over to a man whose manner he did not trust. The coat was in a box in the back room. They did not say anything for a moment. Hattie asked if she might see it. The coat was wool, dark blue, and the certificate was there, folded twice inside a seam in the lining that Luz's mother had opened with a small knife and then closed again with careful stitching. It bore the assessor's seal of Cutter's Fork County dated the 4th of March, 1871, and the names of Luz's parents, Jose and Catalina Bernal, and the legal description of 80 acres of bottomland along the river, which matched exactly the entry in her father's ledger and exactly the discrepancy he had noted between the deed he had seen in the company safe and the county roll he had checked afterward. Hattie went back to the room above the dry goods store and opened the trunk again and looked at the tools. She had known the basics of locksmithing since she was 9 years old, working in her father's shop on Saturday afternoons. She had learned the fine work between 12 and 15, picking pin-tumbler locks and repinning cylinders, while her father watched and corrected her grip. She had learned the safe mechanisms on her own reading the Sheffield catalog and her father's technical notes. and she had serviced 2 residential safes in Chillicothe on her own before she married and moved west. She had not touched a mechanism in 6 years. Her hands remembered before her mind did. She spent 3 days in the room above the dry goods store, working through each of the 22 tools in the oilcloth tray. She disassembled and reassembled the small practice cylinder her father had included in the kit, the one with the replaceable pin stacks that he had made for teaching. She ran through the exercises she could remember from the shop. Her fingers found the old habits. The grip was correct. The feedback through the tension wrench was what she knew it should feel like. The tools were Sheffield manufacture, as her father had written. The picks were still sharp. The tension wrenches were still true. Her father had oiled them before he packed them, and the oil had done its work over the years in the dark interior of the trunk, so that what she lifted out had the quality of something that had been waiting rather than something that had been abandoned. She named each piece aloud as she set it on the floor, the way her father had required when she was learning, not because the naming was necessary, but because naming a tool correctly was the first act of respecting what it was. She was slower than she had been at 15. She expected that, and she did not argue with it. Speed was not the goal. The goal was to understand what her hands still knew and what they had forgotten, and to rebuild the forgotten parts from the principles she had not lost. Her father had believed in principles over procedure. He had told her more than once that a locksmith who memorizes steps without understanding mechanics is one unusual lock away from helplessness. She had internalized this so thoroughly that she had thought of it often during her marriage, watching Clement manage the farm by habit and fall apart whenever the habit failed. She had not said so. It had not been the moment. On the second evening of the 3 days, she picked the practice cylinder clean, all 5 pins stacking in just under 4 minutes. She sat for a moment with the cylinder in her lap. Then she put it back together and did it again. On the 4th day, she went to the county assessor's office and asked to see the land rolls for the Cutter's Fork Basin. The clerk, a young man with ink on his cuffs, told her the rolls were public record. He gave her a look that was not hostile, but was considering, the look of a man deciding whether a woman asking to see land rolls was a curiosity or a problem. She waited without offering an explanation, because she had found, in the weeks since she arrived in Cutter's Fork, that explaining herself first was a habit she needed to break. She had spent 6 years in a house where she explained herself first, and it cost her. She was done with that. He brought the rolls. She spent 4 hours going through them. She had her father's ledger open on the reading table beside her, and she worked through each of the 34 discrepancies he had noted, checking the current roll against his recorded entries from 1872. 30 of the 34 had been altered. The alterations were not crude. Someone with a careful hand and a good knowledge of document preparation had replaced filed certificates with substituted ones, changing the named owners to the Colorado Meridian Land Company, or to one of 3 subsidiary companies she did not recognize. The alterations were old enough that the replacement documents had the yellowed edges of genuine filings. To anyone who had not seen the originals, or who had not seen the company's internal deeds as her father had, the rolls would have read as clean. This was the particular quality of the fraud. She understood. It did not look like a fraud. It looked like a correction of defective filings, the kind of administrative tidying that happened at county offices all the time. A name changed, a survey description revised, a certificate declared invalid, and a new one issued. The families who had lost their land had been told, each in some variation of the same language, that there had been an error in their original filing, and that the company was willing to issue a corrected certificate for a modest fee. When they could not pay the fee, the land was absorbed into company holdings. No one had broken down a door or fired a shot. The mechanism of the taking was paperwork, and the paper had been made to look right. Her father had been in the room when it was not yet right. He had seen the raw material before the finishing was applied, and he had written it down in pencil in a small brown ledger, because he was a locksmith and a cabinet maker, and he believed in making a record of what a thing was before someone changed it. She copied every discrepant entry in a neat column in the back of his ledger. She also noted that 6 of the 34 families still appeared in the county directory, meaning they had stayed in Cutter's Fork, despite the pressure and the disappeared certificates and the men from the land company who had come to their doors. She had already spoken to one of them. There were 5 more. Francis Dugan, who had been watching all of this from a careful distance, asked her one evening what she was doing. Had he told her? Francis sat down on the stool behind the dry goods counter and was quiet for a while. Then she said that her own husband, who had died of a broken leg gone to infection in 1877, had paid $70 for 40 acres of land south of town and had received a county certificate and had his receipt on the same paper as the certificate, and that the land had been taken by the Colorado Meridian Land Company 2 years after his death, on the grounds that his original certificate was invalid, and that she had owed a refiling fee she had not known about and had not paid. She said this without evident emotion, the way a person states a fact they have carried for so long it has worn smooth. Hattie wrote Francis Dugan's name in the back of the ledger. She visited the other 5 families over the following 2 weeks. All of them had some form of original documentation, a receipt, a surveyor's note, a letter from the assessor's office predating the alterations, a certificate sewn into a coat lining or tucked behind a floorboard or folded inside a Bible. None of them had known the county rolls had been altered. None of them had any mechanism for learning that, because the mechanisms available to them had been removed. What they had were the originals, kept against some instinct they could not fully name. The widow Hanks had folded her receipt inside the pages of a Methodist hymnal and placed it on a shelf where it sat for 9 years, among things that no one bothered a widow about touching. A man named Osgood, who had homesteaded 80 acres on the North Creek in 1870 and been told his filing was defective in 1873, had wrapped his original certificate in oilcloth and buried it in a coffee tin behind his woodpile, which he dug up at her request while she stood in his dooryard and watched. He did not ask her who she was or why she needed to see it. He handed her the tin, and she understood that he had been waiting for a reason to dig it up that he could trust. There was a particular quality to each of those conversations. She had expected suspicion, and there was some. At first, what she had not expected was the relief. They were people who had been told the wrong had been done to them, and then told, by the same institution that had done it, that the wrong was in fact a correction, and many of them had half believed it because the alternative was unbearable. Having someone stand in their dooryard and read aloud from a ledger the specific entry that named their original filing as valid seemed to undo something in them that had been held tightly for years. She did not tell them what she was going to do with the information. She did not know yet precisely how it would be done. She knew what the materials were. She knew what the truth was. She was working out the mechanism, the way you work out a mechanism before you touch it, naming the parts in order and identifying the sequence. What they had were the originals. She needed someone who could read a lock. The Colorado Meridian Land Company maintained a branch office in Cutter's Fork on the main street, in a building with a painted facade and a door with a Bramah lock on it, that she had identified on her second pass down that block. The office held, according to her father's ledger, and the letters, at least one document safe. She had no intention of entering the office without legal authority. What she needed was someone who could confirm from outside whether the make and model of that safe was consistent with her father's description of what he had serviced in 1872. She needed someone who knew the safe. There was a retired Wells Fargo Express agent living on the north edge of town whose name appeared in the county directory. His name was Peck, and he was 70 years old and had serviced and transported the same makes of document safes for 30 years. She found him in his kitchen, drinking coffee and reading a church circular, and she told him what she had and what she needed, and he listened without interrupting, which she respected. She did not tell him everything at first. She told him she was trying to confirm the make and model of the safe in the land company's branch office and that she had a professional reason for wanting to know. He asked her what professional reason a woman in Cutter's Fork in November of 1881 might have for identifying the model of a document safe, and she told him she was a licensed locksmith or would-be, and that her father had serviced the company's safe in 1872 and had made notes about the mechanism, and that she wanted to confirm whether the same safe was still in place. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said he would walk by the office that afternoon. He looked at the door. He came back to the room above the dry goods store and told her the office contained a Diebold flat top, model 1868, which he had known as a common choice for land company branch offices, because the company had a contract with Diebold for their Colorado operations. He said a Diebold flat top of that era had a four-wheel combination with a fixed relocking mechanism that any competent locksmith of the period would have known how to service. He asked her why she needed to know. She showed him the ledger. He read it for a long time. He set it down on the table and picked up the letters and read those. He set them down and looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had loaded and unloaded freight for 30 years and still carried the shape of that labor in his knuckles and his wrists. He said very quietly that the Meridian Company had bought the express route his employer had used through the basin in 1878 and had promptly dissolved it, which had cost him his position 2 years before his intended retirement. He had been the senior agent on that route, and he had not found comparable work since, because there was no comparable work to find in Cutter's Fork once the express line was gone. He said he would help her. He said it with the even tone of a man for whom this was simply the next thing on a list that had been waiting. What she needed next was an attorney, and not a Cutter's Fork attorney. She wrote a letter to a firm in Denver that appeared in the back pages of the Rocky Mountain News, a firm that handled land title disputes, and she enclosed a summary of what she had found, 4 pages in her neat hand, with specific reference to the family's the original documents in her father's ledger. She did not mention the letters yet. The letters were for a court. The attorney who wrote back was named Clara Pemberton, which surprised her, though it perhaps should not have. Clara Pemberton came to Cutter's Fork on the train in November, 12 days after Hattie's letter arrived, and she sat in the room above the dry goods store with the trunk open between them, and read the ledger and the letters with the careful speed of someone who has trained herself to read legal documents without letting her face do anything that might be observed and used against her. She asked Hattie how she had come to have the ledger. Hattie told her. Clara Pemberton closed the ledger, placed the letters on top of it, folded her hands, and said that what Hattie had was not merely the basis for a civil action to restore title to the 7 families she had identified. What she had was evidence of systematic fraud against a minimum of 34 property holders and against the county of Cutter's Fork itself, whose rolls had been corrupted. And the letters, which bore the names of Harlan Foss and Aldred Crane, and which described the mechanism of the fraud with administrative precision, constituted in her professional assessment a document of considerable legal weight. She said she would take the case. She also said, carefully, that she needed to know how the trunk had been kept secure for 6 years in a house with a man who had presumably attempted to open it. Hattie told her about the sequence mechanism. Clara Pemberton looked at the trunk for a moment and said that she thought Hattie's father had been a very careful man. He had been, Hattie said. He had been exactly that. The civil proceedings in the title dispute of the Bernal family and 6 associated claimants against the Colorado Meridian Land Company were filed in the Cutters Fork District Court in January of 1882. The documentation presented included the original county certificates or their equivalents, the corrected land roll entries her father had noted, the letters between Harlan Foss and Aldred Crane, and the locksmith's ledger of Samuel Morse, whose entries were attested as authentic by a handwriting examiner from Denver, and whose technical observations regarding the company's document safes were corroborated in a sworn statement by the former Wells Fargo Express agent named Peck. Harlan Foss had left Cutters Fork the previous autumn. No one seemed to know where he had gone. The Colorado Meridian Land Company had, in fact, no legitimate basis for its title to the affected properties. The substituted deeds it had filed were counterfeit instruments. The judge hearing the case was not the judge Hattie had expected, who had ties to the company's Denver interests, but a circuit judge from Pueblo who had received a detailed summary of the proceedings from Clara Pemberton's firm before the original judge had ruled on the preliminary motion. The transfer of jurisdiction was a procedural matter that Hattie did not ask Clara Pemberton to explain in detail, though Clara Pemberton had clearly managed it with some care. The restoration of title to the 7 Cutters Fork families was issued in March of 1882. The company's broader holdings in a basin were the subject of a separate proceeding, which would take longer and involve a different court, and which Hattie did not wait around to see concluded. She had given Clara Pemberton the letters and the relevant portions of the ledger, and she had given sworn testimony before the district court, and she had been present when Luz Bernal's name was read aloud from the restored deed. And she had watched Luz stand a little straighter in her dress and say nothing, which was everything. Frances Dugan got her 40 acres back. She was told this on a Thursday morning in the dry goods store while she was reshelving bolts of calico, and she set down the bolt in her hands and stood for a moment with her back to the room, and then she turned around with a composed face and asked Hattie if she wanted coffee. Hattie said she did. She had, in the meantime, established herself as the only practicing locksmith in Cutters Fork and the surrounding county. She had put a hand-lettered card in the window of the room she still rented from Frances Dugan, reading H. Morse, locksmith, license. She had sent to Denver for the licensing examination materials and had passed the written portion by correspondence and the practical portion before an examiner who had come to Cutters Fork to service the bank and had agreed for a fee to observe her work on a practice mechanism and sign the certificate. She was the first licensed woman locksmith in the territory of Colorado. The examiner had noted this in his records. She had not noted it in anything because it had not been her aim to be the first of anything. Her aim had been to work. In the spring of 1882, she opened a proper shop on the street behind the dry goods store, in a space that had been a tack room and still smelled faintly of saddle leather, which she did not mind. She fitted the door with a Brahma lock. She had rebuilt herself, changed the cylinder herself, and kept the key herself. She installed her father's tools in a cabinet she built from pine boards, each tool in its fitted place, the oilcloth that had wrapped them for 6 years folded beneath them in the drawer. The trunk she kept in the corner of the back room. It was not a closed chapter. The broader land fraud proceedings continued through 1883 and into 1884, and Clara Pemberton's firm asked for Hattie's testimony twice more. She gave it both times. traveling to Denver by train with the ledger in her satchel, and returning to Cutter's Fork the same week. Clement Morse had by then surfaced briefly in New Mexico under a name she did not bother to track, and then disappeared again. She did not pursue him. She had no reason to. What she had were the tools and the shop and the work. By 1884, she had 2 apprentices, both young, one of them the youngest Bernal's son, who had a natural feel for mechanisms and a patience that his mother said he had been born with, and who learned to pick a pin tumbler lock in 3 weeks. She taught the way her father had taught, naming each part before touching it and explaining the theory before demonstrating the practice. She did not become wealthy, in the manner the word usually implies. She became solvent, and then secure, and then, by the late 1882, comfortable. The shop was known as far as Pueblo banks and express offices and county courthouses sent for her by letter when they had mechanisms that needed attention. She charged a fair price and honored the work. The Colorado Meridian Land Company was dissolved in 1885 by order of the Denver District Court, its assets forfeited and its principals named in a judgment that covered the Basin fraud and 2 subsequent cases that Clara Pemberton's firm had built on the foundation of the Cutter's Fork proceedings. Aldred Crane, the attorney whose name appeared in the letters, was disbarred. Hattie read about this in the newspaper and set the paper down on the work table and returned to the mechanism in her hand. There was not much to say about it that the outcome did not already say. When people in Cutter's Fork in later years asked about the trunk in the corner of the back room, she generally answered the same way. She told them it was her father's and that it held his tools, and that the lock was of his own design, and that if they wanted a demonstration, she would show them the mechanism, but not the combination, which was hers to keep. Almost everyone asked about the combination. She always declined to tell them. She would press the panels with her right hand in the order her father had showed her, listening for the faint sequential release of the pins, and then reach around to the back corner with her left hand and turn the stud, and the lid would come up, and the smell of her father's shop would come with it. Cherry, wood, smoke, and fresh walnut, and the clean oiled scent of Sheffield steel. She had read once that a smell was the most faithful thing, that it did not erode the way memory could erode, and she had found this to be true. She stood a moment with the lid up each time before she reached for what she needed inside. It is not a common thing to carry the right tool into the right moment without knowing in advance that the moment is coming. Samuel Morse had known it was coming, in the way a man knows things when he has very little time left, and a daughter he trusts. He had packed accordingly. He had built the mechanism to keep it safe through 6 years of a marriage he had not approved of and could not prevent, and he had trusted the sequence to hold, and it had held. Patience is a kind of engineering. It requires knowing what is worth protecting and building the mechanism that protects it, and then waiting, without flinching, for the right hand to arrive. Hers had been the right hand. She had known that, in the end, the moment she pressed the first panel and heard the faint release of the first pin, on a late afternoon in a rented room in Cutter's Fork, with the east light coming through the window and the smell of Francis Dugan's calico rising up through the floorboards. She had known it then, and she had gone to work. The shop outlasted her by 30 years. Her younger apprentice, the Bernal boy, whose name was Pablo, took it over in 1899 and ran it until 1921, training 3 apprentices of his own and hanging above the work table a framed copy of the county court order from March of 1882, restoring title to the Seven family. The trunk remained in the back room through all of it. Pablo told his own apprentices about it. He told them about the woman who had carried it out of a burning situation and had not opened it until she was ready, and who had taught him that a mechanism you do not understand is not a mechanism. He told them she had said that once, standing at the work table, and that she had never said it as instruction but as observation, the way the best lessons always come. The trunk sat in the corner of the back room with the lid shut and the brass plate catching the light from the south window, waiting, the way a well-made thing waits, for the hand that knows the order of its asking. If you have ever been told to let something go that was not yours to let go, leave a note in the comments telling us what you kept. And if you want another story about a woman who built something no one expected, from what everyone overlooked, one is waiting for you in the list to the right.